The next kind of big thing to think about, and I don't know if everyone knows you should think about this in the very beginning, but is guest list.
Yeah.
You mentioned it before in budget that it really does have a big impact on the overall cost of your wedding and those sorts of things. So as far as, your guest list, how do you start building that out?
Yeah, so I think that once you've had that budget conversation, then you can start thinking about guest list. So what I kind of said before is that your guest list is the biggest contributor to your budget. So a wedding, a $50,000 wedding for 100 people versus a $50,000 wedding for 300 people is a very different style and a very different budget.
Sure.
Because your guest count is contributing to your cost at the venue, your cost at food and beverage, your cost for rentals, invitations, so many items that are priced per person.
Right.
So you want to make sure that you have a realistic number of guests that enters into that budget. So you want to look at the two together.
Sure.
So if you need to shave some money off the budget, cut that guest list down. Cutting 10, 15, 25 people off that guest list can save you a lot of money.
But I wanted to invite my friend I haven't seen since elementary school.
Right. Well, they may not make the list. So I think when you're putting together the guest list, you want to think about, kind of priorities. So I think about dividing your guest list in thirds. One for each couple's, families, and if you have, divorce situations, cut, their third in half, so that everyone has kind of an equal contributor to that overall guest list. And then the couple together also should have a third of that guest list. So think about it in that way. And then ask everyone to prioritize. Obviously your aunts and uncles and grandparents are going to be number one priority, your best friends, but maybe that friend since middle school that you haven't talked to in a while, maybe they're priority too. So they might not be on the list if you can't have a 300-person wedding.
Sure.
So kind of look at it that way as well and start prioritizing your friends and family.
So you kind of jumped ahead on me a little bit, but so handling if one family wants to invite more than the other. I mean, how do you navigate that? This is actually probably more of a psychology question than it is a guest list question, but how do you handle when one half of the equation wants to invite significantly more than the other?
So it can definitely be difficult. You certainly don't want to start off wedding planning, making either side of the family uncomfortable and unhappy. So it's definitely a balancing act. So I think kind of setting expectations up front, like, hey, you have 100 invitations. You can say, hey, this is what fits in our budget, or we're looking at these types of venues and this is our max guest list. So kind of think about it in those terms and set expectations with them. I think it's a little different too if family is contributing money and they want to invite their friends and family, then of course you can kind of have that conversation. Look, if we increase the guest list to accommodate your extra 25 invitations, that's going to cost us X number of more dollars. So are you willing to contribite that money to cover that cost?
That's a good thing. I've got a budget already built out in a spreadsheet.
Exactly. So, keeping in mind that and talking about that, and also just having those conversations with them and being frank, like, look, we don't want it to be really one-sided. We really want this to be a combination of two families and friends coming together. So let's not, kind of make another side of the family unhappy.
Sure. No, absolutely. That's great advice. And then, another one that we've been asked before too is so you're on a budget. Yeah. Everybody's on a budget.
Everybody's on a budget. Doesn't matter what the budget is. Everyone's on a budget.
Hypothetically, if you were invited to someone else's wedding, do you have to reciprocate the invitation?
No, you definitely don't have to. I mean, it gets a little trickier, of course, because you're going to feel a little bit of that guilt. But, I kind of like to think about it. Have you talked to them in the past year? What about in the future? Do you see yourself talking to them in the next year? Do you see yourself talking to them in 5 years? What about 10 years? Like 10 years down the road, are you still going to be friends with this person? If the answer is no, then they're probably not the best person to be there. I mean, at the end of the day, yes, you want to be nice and, reciprocate those feelings, but you got to think about the purpose of this event. The purpose is to celebrate the two of you. I've had couples who've had the rule, if they haven't met both of us, they're not invited. So, just think about those rules. And I think that's another thing when it comes to guest list. Set some rules. So, if I haven't talked to them in the past year, they're not invited. Or if it's a work person, then they're not invited. Or, if they're under the age of 15, they're not invited. Or if they're, 3 family members removed, they're not invited. Set those rules and explain that to both sets of parents and make sure that it's across the board the same rules. So if anyone ever got their feelings hurt, you could say, look, we were having a smaller wedding. We kind of had to stop at second cousins removed, or whatever kind of extension of the family it is.
No, I think that's great. And to kind of dig a little deeper, you mentioned work peeps.
Yeah.
How do you feel about inviting work colleagues?
I think it depends. It depends on your work situation. If you work at a small company and you're inviting 5 of the 8 people, that's uncomfortable. You kind of need to invite all 8 of them. If you work at a big corporation and you're inviting, just your team, sure, that's great. So I think kind of it goes back to that same thing, set the rules, make sure that, if you hang out with them outside of work, then yeah, they're probably your friends and it makes sense to invite them. If you guys just hang out at work, probably don't have to invite them in that. I think it's very easy to explain, you know what, we're just not inviting work people because we didn't want to make it uncomfortable.
Sure. No, that makes perfect sense. I have 2 words for you.
Yes.
Plus ones.
That is literally what I was just thinking. So that can be a whole other, kind of beast of the guest list. So general rule is if they're married, they should definitely get that +1.
Sure.
If they are in a serious relationship, so they're engaged, they live together, they've been together for 5 years, it really is appropriate to invite their +1. If you have someone who's single and doesn't have necessarily a +1, but they know, they're part of your huge group of friends, so maybe all of your sorority sisters or all your work people, then in that case, you don't necessarily have to give them a +1. But if it's a friend who maybe doesn't know a lot of people, or friends who are traveling from afar, who maybe wouldn't come because they would feel uncomfortable without a +1,
sure,
then I think it's a super nice thing to kind of extend that +1 if your budget can allow. So
yeah, it goes back to budget.
It does go back to budget. I mean, you got to think about, would you rather have your friend there with their +1 who you may not know, or
that second cousin that got cut?
Cousin.
Right.
Yeah,
no, it makes sense. No, that's I know that's kind of a tricky thing too.
Yeah.
And now I'm just curious, what would you do if somebody just brought a +1 anyway, or wrote in on an RSVP that they're +2
so
or +1?
Both things can happen. If someone writes in a +1, it's kind of a question of, how uncomfortable do you want to be?
Right. Right.
So, if you really have a tight space or a tight budget and you just don't have the space to allow for that +1, call them, let them know, hey, look, I'm really sorry, but we're on a tight budget, or we just don't have any more space in the venue and we only have 1 chair reserved for you. You can definitely indicate that on the invitation as well to kind of help avoid some of those awkward conversations.
Sure.
Sometimes people just kind of let it go. If someone shows up with a +1, usually your coordinator is going to just kind of make it happen. So that's one of those.
At least have a coordinator.
Yes, at least have a coordinator because they will just make that happen. They'll get them a chair. They'll make sure they have food. Is it ideal? No, but it does happen.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you again for sharing on guest lists. I know it's an important topic that does need to be talked about in the beginning because it really does affect the budget.
It does, and if you're not sure, make yourself an A-list and a B-list. Make those A-list people, they all get saved the dates. Work people could be on that B-list. If you have extra space or you get an indication that a lot of people aren't going to be able to make it, then maybe you send those invitations to the B-list people later on.
Perfect.